we need people to feel a closer connection to the places where they live. For any number of reasons, it will immeasurably improve their quality of life. There's this sort of anonymity that is felt and depersonalization, I think, that a lot of people have in today's built environment because they don't have any connection to the world around them. And if you have even one small building that they can feel that tied to, it is amazing the level of community that is emergent from that.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Towns channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Coby Lefkowitz, author of the new book, Building Optimism, Why Our World Looks the Way That It Does and How We Can Make It Better. It is a fascinating interview, and I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. But before we jump into it, I did want to say, hey, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all the video content that I produce here on the channel. Okay, well, that's it. Commercial over. Let's get right to it with Coby. Coby, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
John, it's such a pleasure to join you. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Hey, Coby, I love giving my guests just an opportunity to introduce themselves briefly. So who the heck is Coby?
I am a trained urban planner practicing as a real estate developer with projects in New York and California. I do quite a bit of writing on the built environment, how we should marry good development practices with good design practices in the pursuit of building a better world.
I love it. And yeah, you have this split life between the West Coast and the East Coast. Where are you at right now today?
I'm on the East Coast. I'm in Brooklyn right now.
Fantastic. That's great. We are going to be talking a little bit about your book, Building Optimism. Let's pull that up right here. This just recently came out in the last few months. I think it was in the latter end of the fourth quarter of 2024. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah, in November.
Fantastic. Yeah. November, December. Yeah. That time frame. And I saw a post from my good friends, Chris and Melissa Bruntlett, holding your book up and going, Building Optimism. I'm like, that's like a cool book. I need to get that. And I'm really glad I did. It is a cool book, and I enjoyed diving into it. What the heck prompted you and inspired you to write a book?
Well, first, I'm glad that it found its way to you. It's been really fun over the last couple of months to get to have these sorts of conversations with people who are thinking really deeply about the built environment and how we can make it better in a number of different parameters that I think, all care about. And that's sort of the genesis for this book. I'm a real estate developer, like I mentioned, by trade, by training. I went to architecture school. And often these disciplines are not in dialogue with each other, and sometimes they can be in conflict with each other, which I always saw as a pretty big problem because they're so interdependent. Cities require buildings and they require investment, and developers require the helping hand of, let's say planners and of course architects and different consultants and skilled professionals that you might have on any given project, but they operate in silos. And what I wanted to do here was sort of give a comprehensive explainer of why our world looks the way it does over the last 100 years. So a discrete set of policy choices, design decisions, imperatives from capital sources that drive development, and how those have all interacted to give us our built environment today in places that look as disparate as a new infill project here in Brooklyn versus a subdivision outside of Phoenix, for example. And it is a story that can be as complex or as simple, as simple as we passed some zoning codes and some building codes, and then a lot of money got involved, and America sort of looks the same for one reason or the other. And it's obviously more complex than that. You can dive into it. But the hope for this book was really explain to people why the world looks the way it does, and that we don't need to be cynical about the present reality. We can take hope, take optimism, and create a better world tomorrow. But if we don't have that foundational knowledge, we really won't have any way of creating that world.
Yeah, yeah. And this is on your website here, and I think this is part of what the book is really all about. Is a call to build a better world, a more beautiful world. And again, this is out here on your main website, your own personal website, which is where you have a lot of your writing, or at least as a platform to getting to a lot of your writing. And some of the themes in the book are just like this: why everywhere looks the same. And so you kind of like peel back several of the layers, proverbial onion, of like trying to understand why places look the way they do now. And really inspiring, from the title of the book, how we can start building more optimism, be more optimistic about building more optimism into the communities. Talk a little bit more about that name, Building Optimism. Why did it come up? Why did that really become the name and the theme that you honed in on? And I suspect it wasn't like an overnight thing. Looking at some of your readings and writings, you've been like talking about optimism for some time.
That's right. I think it was an organic process to come to that specific name for the book, but the concepts have been there for some years. And it's drawn from, I think, this prevailing pessimism about the quality of our cities and towns today, and this belief that we can't do anything good anymore. Sure, we might have been able to build some beautiful structures in the 1920s or in the 17th, 18th centuries, but our best days are behind us. And when you study the canon of works that have been delivered in the past decade or two, that's simply not true. But the unsexy 3-story walk-up in St. Louis, for example, is going to be unheralded. It won't make even though it's a foundationally good piece of urbanism and could be a really handsome structure, you're never going to see that on a blog post or a New York Times article or get broader media traction. Even in its own neighborhood, it might not find its way into the local real estate press. But these are the sorts of structures that America is premised on and is built on. And unfortunately, a lot of the highest profile projects are, on one side, I would say, ideologically driven. And this is a departure in architecture that we can get into, where buildings are more about what they represent than how they make people feel or the experience or their aesthetic value. So we can put that to one side. And then on the other, it's about a dollar amount. We built this brand new structure for $3 billion. We invested $15 billion into transit. And that leads to a level of, I think, anonymization of the built environment on the transactional side, where it's just about dollars. And then this sort of esoteric, closed off, a friend of mine who's written a lot about this, his name's Samuel Hughes. He writes in Works in Progress, which are all of his articles, as far as I'm concerned, are indispensable, about easy to understand and more difficult to understand architecture, where one may well like Boston City Hall, the famous brutalist structure, or the FBI headquarters in DC, but it requires a certain level of education to understand all of the influences and motifs and references that are being layered into those structures, versus walking by a Queen Anne townhouse. One doesn't need to understand that it's beautiful. It simply is. And there's this tendency in architecture to over-intellectualize and over-refer to structures for a number of reasons. And so I think that's sidelined a lot of people in America, in North America more broadly, from feeling as though they have any agency in the built environment, feeling as though they can't do anything positive, and that it will be done unto them and it won't be good. So the thrust of the book is to say, you can start with a tree on your block, or you can paint the side of a building, and maybe you can work your way up to a 1-story structure, a 3-story, this sort of incrementalism, and take hope that good things are possible, because the only way that we built good things in the past was from the spirit of the people who built them, and they had a passion that sort of furthered them along this path.
Right, right. Now, you had mentioned infill development, and the projects that you have going on in San Diego appear to be very much a part in that theme of looking for opportunities to do add some density, create more housing in a location that is in a severe need for housing, like many other places around the world and across the United States, and really leaning into the fact that from an active towns perspective, if we have denser housing, if we have more housing availability within meaningful destination to places, meaningful distances, very walkable, bikeable distances to meaningful destinations, we're able to have we're able to create those desirable, walkable places that, really people want.
That's right. So these projects on the site, I definitely should update it. These are from a couple of years ago when we were first starting out.
Yeah, this is 2021. Yeah, is when you first founded. Yeah.
And which it's a great exploration for us to go from smaller projects to a little bit larger and figure out what works, what doesn't, what we enjoy, what we don't. And when you have a fledgling firm, it's all part of the act of discovery. But from the day that we started the firm to the present, we have sought to build projects that are in close proximity to restaurants or cultural amenities or a library or a coffee shop. Because walkability, bikeability, this more permeable and fine-grained way of working through cities is what we care about. I often draw this distinction, and this comes from my background as a planner. I know some people would disagree with this, but I think it's nonetheless true. And this is a great example of this sort of urbanism. It's a beautiful new residential college in New Haven at Yale, but it fundamentally gets the relationship with the street right. And it is in close proximity to the rest of the campus. It's on the northern edge of campus, so it's a little bit further away from downtown. But nonetheless, it is a place that you can easily walk to other places. It's a place that you could easily bike. There are people who have cars, but there needs to be many different modes in any given city for various number of reasons. And our projects seek to add to whatever good is already in a neighborhood and further it such that another building block 2 years from now or 3 years from now or 10 years from now can build on the work of today, which in and of itself is building the work of the past. And I think part of the reason why people feel disenchanted with development patterns today is so much of it is greenfield. And as Chuck Marone and the folks at Strong Towns write much about, built to a finished state. So there is no living heritage, and there's very little opportunities for organic walkability. If you live in a subdivision 10 miles outside of town, where are you walking to? If you even had sidewalks to walk to a commercial development, which likely you don't have either in that location. So we're much more focused on building in cities with established street networks that can go from one level of density to another, and to allow for more people to enjoy the benefits of urbanity.
Yeah, yeah. And you do a good job too in the book too of, like bringing up examples of regions and how they navigated their own context, their own situations. In Charleston, South Carolina, you profiled Portland, Oregon, you profiled Santa Barbara. These are all places that, they look very, very different. Each and every one of them has its own sort of, feel to it. Talk a little bit about that decision to like kind of lean in towards, profiling some of these, cities and what you were looking to tease out for your audience, for the readers.
To give a model of what good development looks like can be a tricky thing. So you might say, look at this beautiful 17th century Italian village. And it may well be beautiful, and you may well want to build that somewhere in the US, but the context and conditions that gave rise to that village are so foreign to our present moment that it really can't be relied upon as any form of precedent. And the same may be said for a contemporary project in Vietnam. It could be a wonderful townhouse or cafe, but the financial dynamics, the regulatory environment that is present in somewhere like Vietnam makes it it's not analogous for our context here. And so in profiling work like this that we see in Santa Barbara, this is a project from Jeff Shelton, who I believe is one of the best practicing architects in America today for the whimsy and beauty of his designs, shows people that these are places that we can actually create today. It's not some reference from 400 or 500 years ago. It's not some country halfway around the world. These are towns that might be an hour away from where you live. For some people listening, it may be where you live. And I use the three cities that you mentioned as cases at various points along the spectrum. So we have Charleston, which is a historic city founded in the 17th century, and it has this wonderful built heritage. Funnily enough, that heritage has been preserved because in the mid-century period, it wasn't wealthy enough to tear itself down with urban renewal and urban highways. And so you have
But isn't that funny though? So much of like the good urbanism that we have that still exists are oftentimes from cities that were too poor to actually tear down their cities. They may have like spread outward, but when we look at some of the places that have some of the best bones, you think of places like Buffalo and Pittsburgh and a few others where they're just, oh yeah, there's such an incredible stock still existing of beautiful old buildings. Oftentimes it was, even Detroit, oftentimes it was just because they were too poor to tear everything down.
That's right. It's this very strange condition where in order to be successful for the 21st century, from an urbanist perspective, I think the ideal trajectory is very wealthy in the 19th century or some 18th century heritage, but not many American cities have that. Down on your luck, let's say, in the mid-century period, and now seeing some sort of renaissance in the 21st century because of institutions or innate charm that a city might have. So Charleston has universities, and it is a port city, and there's a number of beaches that will always bring people back to the region, and I think that's important. Here, is an example of projects in Fort Greene, which is a historic neighborhood, a 19th century suburban neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York City. And it's analogous to Charleston, where you can take this historic fabric and create projects that are contextual to what was built 100, 150 years ago, and use that as a building block. Some may view this as pastiche. I don't really perceive it as such because these places are in such strong demand. It's the market telling us that, hey, people really want to live in a federal style townhouse or a brownstone or neo-Grec, et cetera, whatever the style might be. So this is one body of cities, and most of them are going to be in the Northeast, in some smaller cities in the South, and maybe a handful of cities in the Midwest, where you take the lessons from history, you use those development patterns as a foundation, and new projects can riff on that in some way, but you don't really deviate too much from those established traditions. That will work for some cities. For other cities, like Santa Barbara, you may not have an established tradition of brownstone Brooklyn, let's say. And so you have to create your own. And this is one of the most fascinating stories I found in the research of the book, is this notion that Santa Barbara is a Spanish colonial city or Spanish revival is entirely contrived. It was not a Spanish city. It's something that has become socialized over the last century. But projects like this were the direct result of a couple really passionate and thoughtful and motivated civic boosters who wanted to establish a new vernacular for their region. And for a number of reasons that are really interesting. There was this marriage of figures who decided that Andalusian, or southern Spain, architecture was well suited for Southern California because the climates were similar and there was the peoples and cultures were sort of similar. And the very quick story here, which I think is instructive, is a couple of civic boosters, Bernard Hoffman and Pearl Chase, championed this style. There was the Panama Exposition in San Diego, I think in 1916. I don't have the exact name for that, but it celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal. It was a World's Fair of sorts. And if you go to Balboa Park today in San Diego, you'll see these Churriguesque and Spanish Revival structures that are just exquisite. And so you have these references that are being built out in the early 20th century. Architects, for new interesting reasons, are designing these buildings here. The most interesting reason is that with the outbreak of World War I, architects could no longer travel throughout Europe, and one of the few regions they could go to was Spain. And so they brought back those styles out of pure happenstance. And so it was complete convenience. And it leads to this result where a couple of structures are built in Santa Barbara in this style in the late 1910s, early 1920s. There's a devastating earthquake in 1925 that flattens most of Santa Barbara. And the few structures that are remaining after the earthquake are Spanish Revival because of the durability and robustness of the construction methods.
I found that story so interesting and so endearing. As a fourth generation Angelino, I have deep roots in the Southern California area dating back to the 1800s, and I had no clue on the storyline of this. And so to be able to understand that direct sort of line, the dotted line, back to that, almost World Fair type event down in Balboa Park, down in San Diego. And then, like you said, this vernacular, this style that now is pervasive across all of Southern California. You see it in Los Angeles, you see it in Orange County, San Diego, as well as Santa Barbara. But like you said, the individuals who really leaned into it in Santa Barbara make Santa Barbara what it looks like today. And I just found that so fascinating. And I actually do spend quite a bit of time in San Diego. Santa Barbara. I've got family there. And so I go back frequently. And in fact, have produced some Active Towns videos on their emerging bike network that the city is actually working on to make it more walkable and bikeable, to go hand in hand with some of this amazing and beautiful architecture that has been, I think, become synonymous with what Santa Barbara is.
Absolutely. And we have to say, not every place will be as blessed as Santa Barbara with the weather, the natural advantages, and the culture that exists. But it has a relatively simple gridded street network that is felicitous to bikeability, and they have relatively decent sidewalk network. There are some core elements that make this a place that could, or that had prosperity and could reinvest into the built environment. But on the whole, it was the decision that a few key civic boosters made to drive the city towards a more positive and optimistic, we'll say, direction. And I think, or I don't think, I know that if there was a 21st century analog that wanted to chart a course, there's no reason they couldn't do that. So pick a city anywhere in the country in any architectural style or mode that they prefer, they could fashion themselves after Santa Barbara. Now, of course, they don't have the California coast. They may not have the level of wealth or prosperity, but they don't need to. It can start at a pretty small level and compound over time if you concentrate those efforts within a couple of blocks and you go out from there, as opposed to this sort of hop, skip, and a jump development pattern of we're going to build a $100 million subdivision 5 miles this way and then a $200 million one 10 miles that way. You dilute the quality of your impacts. But if a city were to say, we're going to take this determined and assiduous approach to reinvest into a core area, and we're going to inhibit it, growth outside of that, I think the results would be utterly remarkable. And it would very quickly instill a belief, not just in the people of that region, but more broadly, at what the impact of concentrated efforts can be if enough of the most important stakeholders are rowing in the right direction,
Yeah.
or the same direction.
One of the things that comes to mind using Santa Barbara as a good example is the balance that the city is trying to come to with regards to the car and cars, and the fact that, if we allow cars to take over our public realm, our streets, they diminish, that they start to demean the quality of that experience of the beautiful architecture that you even have. And State Street is a great example. Of course, during the pandemic, they pedestrianized State Street as a means to try to save a lot of the restaurants, similar to many other cities around the globe. But then they've been back and forth and hemming and hawing as to, okay, how do we deal with State Street? Do we partially open it up? Do we allow it to continue to be biking and pedestrian realm? And they're probably going to be some sort of a quasi balance. I think that has literally happened within the last few weeks or months of reopening it to cars to some level, but trying to traffic calm things down. Address that from your perspective, from the perspective of, we can have beautiful places and beautiful buildings and beautiful, networks, but if we turn the public realm over to fast moving traffic, and lots of them, it really undermines that quality experience and the beauty, I think.
This is where my background as an urban planner comes in, and I'd be very curious to tease this out with you. I think at base, anyone who studies cities from a planning perspective knows that there is not, even if you were to give equal consideration to different modes of transport, because of the, shall we say, ferocity or relative ferocity of different modes of transportation, there can't be an equal consideration. If we allow people and bikes and buses and trams and cars and trucks to share the same roadway, cars and trucks are just going to dominate all the other modes of transportation because these are much more impactful forces. So it is not the case that we can simply have proportionate allocations to each mode of transportation. Where I differ a little bit from some urbanists and some planners is that I think there is a place for cars in our cities. And I don't know that pedestrianizing downtown cores entirely makes sense, only because we have some historic precedent, specifically in the 70s, where there's this wave of pedestrianization and pedestrian plazas in response to these very conditions, where the excesses of the 50s and 60s were being pushed back on. And the city said, how do we take control back from cars? And the answer that was turned to was to close down through traffic to cars on main streets. And of those hundreds of plazas that were developed in the 70s, 3 remain today. It's Burlington, Vermont, Boulder, Colorado, and Charlottesville, Virginia. What do all of those cities have in common? They are college towns, and the main streets are in close proximity to the campuses. And there is enough density of people to support the uses downtown. That's something that sort of, to get back to this holistic conversation of how do we create more optimistic cities, it doesn't make sense in a vacuum to pedestrianize a core if you don't have the density of housing or commercial services around it, or else you're going to get sort of a barren streetscape. But at the same time, you need to seed that ground, or so that people can find comfort in going downtown and then say, oh yeah, maybe I'll consider living here previously there wasn't anything, and now there's benches and trees and a new shop that opened up. And so it has to be this complementary process. And I think if one outpaces the other, then we won't get to that comprehensively good core. It is obviously the case that car primacy and car dependency has so far outpaced the other considerations of city building that needs to be reined in to a considerable extent. But I think we need to be cautious in these conversations to say, let us totally pedestrianize or make this totally bikeable, because a lot of cities don't have the other elements to be able to support that. Santa Barbara does, DC does, New York does, Philly does, but most places probably do not.
Yeah. And what we have on screen here is an image where we see what I would consider a pedestrian first sort of environment in the sense that for drivers entering in this space, it sends a clear message that this is not a place for speed. And that is probably the most important aspect that I see in terms of the degradation of the public environment that cars give to our cities, is that they have been seeded over a fairly large swath of real estate, and they're encouraged to be there. So you have volumes of cars, and the drivers are encouraged to drive fast. And so then you have a hostile environment as well. This message, this scenario here sends a much different message to the drivers. It's no. This is shared space. This is a different realm. You need to slow down. You're invited to park here. And when you're traveling through here, you're driving at a much more reasonable human pace, which is exactly what the Dutch have done so incredibly well with most of their dense urban environments, their residential streets, their wooners, and all of that. Is there shared space, and there is architecture and street design that reinforces that this is a slow speed environment.
Absolutely. So this, I'm in complete agreement with you here. And this, for anybody watching, is Chevy Chase Lakes, just outside of DC in Chevy Chase, Maryland. It is a transit-oriented development on the Purple Line, and there is some provision for parking, but it is a people-first space. And having spent time here, it is wonderful. It is off of a fairly busy road. I believe it's Connecticut Avenue. And the further you get from DC, this is just on the border, the more car dependent it becomes. But this is a good example, I think, of that concentrating of efforts that we were just talking about, where it is close to the city's core and it's really high density. And it allows for this level of human primacy because you're not so diffuse in a way that you are elsewhere. So I think it's a really good example for that reason. It's also fantastically beautiful. For mid-rise, we're so used to seeing these 501s that are dispiriting, maybe at best, and these are soulful and characterful buildings. I was just in Amsterdam 2 weekends ago doing research for a project that we're working on in upstate New York, gathering precedents, and I went to Utrecht and Leiden and Haarlem and a number of small towns. What struck me first was how easy it was to get between each of these cities. From Amsterdam to Utrecht, from my hotel room to, let's say, the first cafe I walked in, it took 35 minutes or 40 minutes. And I didn't even look at the train schedule. I just walked into the station. I looked up at the schedule there or the platform list and said, okay, 4 minutes heading to Utrecht. It was incredible. That's in New York, the subways don't come that frequent, and they have intercity transit, right, which is fantastic. But also when you walk around those cities, they have these historic medieval cores. Cars are allowed, but to your point, they are made to feel as visitors, not as though they have domain or the exclusive domain. And this is something that you've talked about on the podcast before, and I think has now become accepted in the worlds of planning, if not transportation planning, but certainly city planning, is that people are going to drive the speeds that they feel comfortable at. They don't care what the speed limits are. So how do you make people drive slower? You introduce the VUNERF, the kink out in the road, to make it a shared street. You introduce trees instead of clearing all the trees and then setting back all the buildings 20 feet on either side, so your right of way becomes 60 or 70 or 100 feet wide in a quiet residential area so that people feel comfortable going 60 miles an hour. Now you have to be a little bit more cautious. You can't drive that fast if a kid might walk out into the road, or if a little bit of a bump may force you to hit the tree just next to you, right? And so I think the Dutch have done an excellent job, at least in their cores, of accommodating different modes of transportation and making people and bikes feel more comfortable.
Yeah. This is actually some video just, from me riding from the Utrecht Central Station to the apartment where I was staying at for about 3 weeks this past summer. And the image, the visualization that we see here that just really shocks us from a North American perspective is just how many mobility options people have. You mentioned the train service, intercity, being able to get from Amsterdam to Utrecht in a matter of about 20 minutes or so. You see the tram running here on the street that gets you down one of the busiest cycle streets as well as transit streets, which is this one right here. But then you also see that you have this vast network of ability to ride a bike. But then you'll also see in just a moment here that, it's still possible to get around by car. And so we don't have to just assume that, in North America, the only way to get anywhere is by car. Therefore, we need to just give up. That's the cynicism that you're trying to counter in this book and say, of course, everybody's going to drive. Well, the way we've been doing it, of course everyone is going to be, because it's the only real option in most cities in North America we've given people.
What I love about this video is that if this were in Houston or Orlando, from building face to building face, that could probably be 8 lanes, and it would be, and there wouldn't be sidewalks. But here you have protected bike lanes on either side of this roadway. You have central medians, you have plantings on either side. And it does go to show that if, again, not disproportionate provision, but I think considered provision for each mobility choice is given, that there is a way to accommodate all of these people in one space. What I was utterly amazed at in Utrecht was you come into the central station, and of course there's a new bike garage that has been delivered there. In the largest in the world, right? I think it's 12,000 spaces or something approaching that. And every space is completely full. And you walk outside of the station, and there are still thousands of more bikes that are chained up on the blocks surrounding the station. And I was asking the people I was with, or in cafes, how is it possible that in a city of 300,000 people, and it's a slightly larger region, it's a part of the Randstad, but still, it's not a huge city, you see 15, 20,000 bikes in one place. You don't see that in New York, anywhere close to that. You might see corrals of 30 bikes in New York, and that's only because you have delivery drivers who are hanging out, grabbing coffee together before they go back out on their runs. And so Amsterdam is widely regarded, and Copenhagen, as cycling capitals by people, I think, who are not necessarily as entrenched in the planning movement. But if you go to a city like Utrecht, it is even more stark.
Yeah. This is some video that I shot during a lunchtime of Dutch workers just taking a break during lunch to go for a walk. I was assuming that they're all heading to cafes down there, but the Dutch reminded me that the majority of these folks probably already maybe had their bite to eat or whatever, and they're just out stretching their legs. And it's tremendous how many of them are making the trek from the camera's going to pan and look towards some of these high rises in the distance. Up, they're kind of covered by the trees, but behind there are several headquarter buildings for a variety of different companies there. And yeah, they just come out in the hundreds every day to walk in and get some fresh air in. And so a lot of times people just kind of poo-poo the Dutch cities, the Amsterdams and the Utrechts and whatever, and say, oh, it's just all about bikes and all they do is bike, et cetera. No, I mean, it really is a balance of pedestrian activity, people getting around, pragmatically, because it's a practical, pragmatic way to get around is to get on a bike and get to your meaningful destination. But then they also use the trams. They also use their personal automobiles. They own automobiles at pretty high percentages as well. They just aren't addicted to them. They don't feel forced that that's the only thing that they can use to be able to get around.
I think that's a really important point that American urbanists and planners have to take more seriously. There is this almost approaching fundamentalism for anti-cars in the US in certain cities. And I understand the sentiment. Traffic fatalities are an unacceptable reality of living in many cities around the country today. This is an entirely solvable issue. Maybe there is some non-zero amount of fatalities that are going to occur, terrifyingly so, but it is nonetheless, maybe there's some amount. It's not 40,000 people a year. And I think as we look to models, and this is a courtyard in Harlem, which is serving as direct precedent for one of our projects, if we want to think about moving towards a world that looks like this, it's going to require constituencies that feel as though they're a part of this vision. And if we tell 95% of the electorate, if you don't, who own cars or who move about in cars, if we're not willing to have a conversation with you about how we can accommodate you in this broader vision, we're not going to be able to build these coalitions. And so I think it's important when you even look at these wonderful medieval cities, there are roads. Cars go through these cities. There are underground parking garages. It's not like Houston where 50 to 60% of downtown is reserved for parking lots, parking structures, roadways, et cetera, which is an unforgivable, I think, proportion of land to be wasted in such a robust economic center. But yeah.
Yeah, and as you said, these are some inspirational photos. Precedent. You mentioned that you traveled over there to do some research for a project, and yeah, as I was mentioning earlier, the context and the texture of the materials that the Dutch use. You look at this street here, you see that it's paved in clinkers. Clinkers is what they refer to as their red bricks. But yeah, to your point, if we zoom in on this photo and kind of scan over, we see, yep, there's the cars. There are motor vehicles here. It's not that it's anti-car. It's not. It's just that they, for lack of a better term, they've been sort of tamed. They've not been allowed to be wild beasts that completely dominate the space and take over, as you had mentioned, like we might see in a place like Houston, where not only is the percentage of the space huge, but they've also been allowed to take over just because of the level of violence and speed in which the vehicles are encouraged to go.
That's right. It's rather jarring to walk around these cities and see how simple it could be. And it's about a series of policy decisions to make it work. And I think building the sorts of projects that hopefully we can make good on. I like this project that's now being shown on screen, to incrementally, and this is on a parking lot, mind you, in the heart of a historic city in upstate New York, in Kingston, New York, to fill in those patches and to make a city bit by bit more felicitous to urbanism. And it is a long process, but it's one that's eminently possible. It just requires, your little bit of optimism to get that started. And I think that's what I'm trying to show in practice is to not just write about or show certain projects, but to really put my money where my mouth is. I'm going to try to. We have these lofty goals, and we'll see if we're able to meet them. I hope that we will. We're going to work really hard to try to get there. But I think the prevailing methodology of development, or at least maybe the sentiment, has been one of indifference for much of the last several decades. It has sort of been this entropy of just spreading out and in these chaotic and planned and unplanned ways, but not comprehensively. And if we have even a little bit more attention or consideration paid to the quality of the projects that we're building, I do think people will be shocked at what the tapestry of those projects, once strung together, can result in.
Yeah. One of your latter chapters talks about stewardship. Expand upon that a little bit more.
It's an unsexy concept, but it is nonetheless as important as anything else in the book. One can have the grandest vision for a city, and it may well be the most beautiful place on earth. But if there's no one to take care of the day-to-day operating realities and the maintenance, it will all be for naught. These are things that we don't often think about. Are the sewer lines clear? Is the water going to be pumped into the city? Who's picking up the trash on the streets? Are we maintaining building facades so that bricks aren't falling on people's heads when they walk by? Is there a network of streetlights at night so that people can move between blocks without feeling unsafe being in the dark? A number of examples like that. And in the book, I specifically point to the maintenance of buildings and not just streets or parks as a part of that stewardship. Any structure that we revere from the past has only made it here because it has been loved caringly for generations of students. And we need to create, I think, places that are not only capable of capturing the affections of today's residents, but of posterity as well, or else the environmental consequences of this fast, casual, cycling through development are going to be rather profound. We need people to feel a closer connection to the places where they live. For any number of reasons, it will immeasurably improve their quality of life. There's this sort of anonymity that is felt and depersonalization, I think, that a lot of people have in today's built environment because they don't have any connection to the world around them. And if you have even one small building that they can feel that tied to, it is amazing the level of community that is emergent from that.
Your final chapter is really a call to action. And, in the spirit of what you just said, you say basically everyone reading this has the capacity to be a built environment advocate and really is a call to action for folks. Expand on that.
I wanted to instill some level of agency in people who read this because it can be dispiriting to especially follow a lot of the discourse in city building today about how large the numbers are and how big the projects are and how difficult it is to even, you can look at Los Angeles or San Francisco, to build a bus stop. A bus shelter could take 7 years of reviews, and then you see the final result and go, this cost $4 million? It doesn't make any sense, right? And so it is very easy to succumb to that cynicism and feel a total loss of agency. But I think it's important to remind ourselves that the only reason anything around us exists is because there was a group of people in the past who created it such that we can enjoy it today. That is true of the bad, but it is even more true of the good, especially when we have stewardship that gets wrapped up into it. And so I want people to take that away at a high level, but then more specifically, to see themselves as those actors. There is no reason why you can't become a developer or an architect or a planner. These are just skills that you can pick up. And honestly, for development, yes, there are financial barriers, but you can start very small and work your way up there. There is really no specialized skill. You have to learn on the job. yes, you can. I'm teaching a class right now on real estate development, so you can absolutely go to school, you can learn it, and that's great. But I think a lot of the experience comes from running your own projects and on the ground, and that's not something that um, has any level of privilege to it. The This line I've taken to saying recently is that a lot of I think a lot of the pessimism around our built environment is that people don't think we deserve much better. We are a consumerist, hyper capital society. This is naturally what you get. And I firmly reject that. I think you only get what you reach for. And so if you don't seek for anything better, you won't get it. If you don't view certain structures or virtues as worth aspiring towards or embodying in the built environment, you won't have them. And the only thing that differentiates a resident of, let's say, Topeka, Kansas, who doesn't have a structure like the Duomo in Italy or let's say Notre Dame in Paris, is the fact that yes, there's a money and a resources consideration, but there's no reason they couldn't have a smaller version of that. It is a cultural prison that we put ourselves into. And this is true of anywhere in the world. So you really can start that process today. It's just about gathering the people and, more than anything, the will to do that. And I think that comes from primarily believing that it's possible. So that's the thrust of the book.
Yeah. Also, in the very last chapter, you also channel the fact that, yeah, we've really destroyed the fabric of many of our cities, running interstate highways through it, and really, creating massive problems. It looked like we were heading in the direction of being able to have some good resources in terms of finances, and especially coming down from the federal perspective to address some of those challenges. And then a new administration comes along, and it's very doubtful that there will be any kind of federal funds available for anything about repairing some of the damages to our cities. That's one of the challenges with writing a book, is that you're writing it based on the context that you're in now, without having the crystal ball of imagining what could be happening, and no one could imagine what the reality that we're in now. To close us out, talk a little bit about how we can remain optimistic in these dire times, and if you have any wisdom from your young career here, because you haven't been doing this for all that long, what ideas or assumptions or this might just be intuition on your part as to what we need to do?
I talk with a lot of developers, planners, architects, built environment professionals generally around the country. And sometimes there is this throwing up of the hands to say, oh, well, we can't do that. And I challenge them on that. Understanding the models as I do, we've run our own firm for about 4 years, but I've been working in development for the better part of a decade now. And at previous firms that I worked for, at my own firm now, there are certain undeniable realities of putting together a development project or to build a structure. But it doesn't mean that every structure has to be the lowest common denominator. There are ways that we can get creative. And indeed, there are many hundreds of people around the country who are getting extraordinarily creative to deliver projects that are wonderful. So some of the projects that you've shown on screen today are very expensive. And they are designed for people who are wealthier or different stages of their life. And that can feel unattainable. But in the book, as online, I've profiled many hundreds of projects that are either affordable, your lowercase a affordable, uppercase a affordable, or just general middle class housing or commercial structures that aren't designed for the top white shoe firms that you might find in New York, as one example, or a large hedge fund. They're just neighborhood level structures. And they're being completed with an increasing frequency, so that every year we're seeing a higher amount or a higher proportion of good projects. One, that's a market signal. So I'd rather live in a more beautiful building, or I'd rather work in a more beautiful building. We know from the academic literature that hospitals, for example, that are designed more in accordance with biophilic principles or more humanist principles lead to better health outcomes from the folks who are being treated there, from patients. So there is an empirical backing to this as well. It's not just an aesthetic argument to develop better cities. And it's not just a financial argument to say that you're going to get better rent. It is this holistic perspective. And I do believe that we are seeing this groundswell. It's not a post-COVID phenomena. This started in the early 80s. And we're 40, 45 years into this reinvestment into cities. And I think that's really important for people to keep in mind. One, to take hope that we've been doing this for a while, but that the seeds you see flowering today were planted a very long time ago. And doing anything in the built environment does take quite a bit of time. So it's that can, I guess, be a little bit dispiriting, but there's something that's been finding its way in the milieu of, let's say, the tech world, and certainly some level of entrepreneurialism that says a project might take 3 or 5 years to build, but those years are going to pass anyway. So would you rather have started the project and then in 3 years you can look back and say, look at all we've accomplished? Or would you have been mired in this internal prison that you put yourself in and say, oh, it's going to take too long, we can't do it? So yes, it's a long process. That time's going to pass anyway. I think let's charge forward forcefully, optimistically, that we can build that more perfect, or that better, not even perfect future, because it's been done over the last several decades.
Yeah, and leaning in towards, some of the themes that we had talked about earlier of infill development and reuse. You referenced the fact that the Kingston project is like a former parking lot. It's like reimagining. I mean, let's not think about these huge, massive greenfield developments way outside in the hinterlands. It's like, what do we have that we can move quickly on? Can we start some simple changes to, within our own cities to be able to make it easier to do some infill, to do some thickening, as Chuck Marohn likes to say, of the housing stock, ADUs and everything else that needs to happen, because we need housing quickly, not something that's going to necessarily always take a 10-year horizon to come to fruition.
I totally agree. Our first projects were ADUs, and they would have been far quicker to build if we weren't in Southern California, where it's a very difficult, well, much of anything. But in Texas, you can get a permit in a couple of weeks, and you can build one of those structures in 4 months. That's very quick. And I am firmly on the ADU maximalism end of the spectrum, that they can deliver extraordinary benefits. They're small, but if you take a city like San Diego that has alleyways, and just say there's 300,000 units of housing, 70% of that is single family homes, and some material percentage adds one ADU to their backyard, let's say 20% or 30%. Now we're talking upwards of 50,000 housing units that can get delivered in a city of 1 million people. I mean, that is a really significant amount of housing to be delivered that can be accomplished quickly. It's not so simple as that quick math equation. But I firmly believe that there's great impact that can be delivered there. And there are places that need higher density, and so much more so, but it is simply true that it's easier to build a 3-story structure than a 20-story structure. And it doesn't make sense to build, in some cases, 3-story structures, in some cases, 20-story structures. So we have to, again, in this Chuck Marohn sense, like incrementally progress forward what a neighborhood wants to grow up to be. It doesn't make sense to go from 2 stories. I was just in Toronto, where much of the city is low rise, and then you have these major corridors where you have 50 and 60-story towers. It's very strange. It leads to a very curious development pattern. And I really like Toronto, but the city would be much better suited, in my opinion, if they went to a uniform density of up to 5 stories in most core neighborhoods. They could actually support a tram and a transit system, which they can't really right now. I mean, it works in some respects, but I was staying on a pretty busy street, and I had to bike 15 minutes away to go to a subway stop. It didn't make any sense. And so, yeah, there are ways that we can do this if we really want to get into the numbers more or less realistically. But I think it's about widening the aperture of what we perceive as possible.
Yeah. Real quickly to close this out, you mentioned, the ADUs and them being small. What is small to you from a developer's perspective? What, from a square footage perspective? I mean, and not in the Manhattan mindset, but across North America, what would you consider being small for these livable kind of places? Just curious.
I'll provide a spectrum, but I'll say that without personal bias, in cities around the world, there's typologies of micro units that are cherished for the affordability they confer, the proximity they allow for. So in Paris, you have chambres de bonne, which are the top floor of the Haussmann apartment buildings. And these are 150 square feet. I mean, they're tiny. In Tokyo, you have a similar condition where in the heart of, or a 10-minute walk from Shinjuku, you might have an 100 square foot, very, very, very efficient studio that costs only a couple $100s a month. And there are people who are willing to make that trade-off. So there is an economic argument there. But everyone is going to have a different level of minimum housing that they would require. So for some people, 1,000 square feet might be too small if they have several kids running around. And for others, that might be too big to manage. So I want to be careful not to impart my own biases and say that it's contextual. So in San Diego, those ADUs were actually a little bit bigger. They were 900 square feet and 1,100 square feet, the first ones. But in our second project there, we built, it was legislatively an ADU, but it was functionally a duplex. So we built 550 square feet and 800 square feet. But we're now working on a project where there are studios that are 375 square feet and one bedrooms that are less than 450 square feet. So it is a spectrum.
Yeah. Well, and the reason why I wanted to hone in on that is because I live in a 1946 cottage that, is less than 750 square feet. I mean, back in the day, this is, it's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath home. I mean, we didn't call them tiny houses. They were just houses. They were starter houses.
It's so funny you say that because our first project, that 35th Street project, has a beautiful bungalow, but a craftsman home that is a 2-bed, 1-bath, 750 square feet. It's fantastic. And so it was relatively easy to rent up because it had a yard and it was beautiful and it was enough space for a couple to start their life in. So I think there does need to be a reframing of what we think density looks like. And I'm guilty of this certainly, need to move away from the abstract notion of density and square footages to the more qualitative considerations of, well, what sort of life can you build here?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason why this works for us is we are in a downtown adjacent neighborhood where everything is walkable and bikeable. It's all about proximity. So yes, it's a single family home, but it's on a relatively small lot. It's a relatively small place. Thankfully, the city has actually opened up the ability for us to add 2 additional more dwellings onto this lot. So that's fantastic. If we so choose, we could certainly do that. And that would add even more density, to our neighborhood. But the fact that we can get on the bike, be downtown in like 5-10 minutes, walk, to all these meaningful destinations is what really makes it all work. And it really makes what I talk about, that relevance between the housing discussions that we're having and the densities that we're talking about and the ability to create walkable, bikeable places, because there's meaningful destinations within easy walking and biking distances. Active towns. Yeah, fantastic. Coby, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much. And congratulations on your first book. Folks, pick up your own copy of Building Optimism. We'll include a link down below in the show notes. If folks want to follow along with your work, where's the best way for them to track you down?
I'm on Twitter at Coby Lefko and at buildingoptimism.com or Substack Building Optimism as well. John, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk and to nerd out on all things cities, planning, transportation. It's really been a lot of fun.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Coby Lefkowitz. And if you did, please, hey, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and be sure to ring that notifications bell to turn on all notifications. And once again, if you're enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Again, just navigate over to activetowns.org. Click on the support tab at the top of the page, and there's several different options. You can become a Patreon supporter. Again, patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content, but you can also buy me a coffee as well as make a contribution to the nonprofit. Again, every little bit helps and is very much appreciated. Okay, that's it for now. So until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And a huge shout out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel via YouTube Super Thanks, Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit. I could not do this without you. Thank you all so very much.